History is everywhere here in Florence, even down to the smallest detail. There are things that tell a different story about the way things used to be in this city. And one example of this are the Ferri, the ironworks that are on the front of many buildings in the city. One person who knows all about it is John Superti, who's written a book. John, why did you focus in on these ironworks?
Well, I've always been interested in photographing gargoyles and faces on things. And in 2008, I photographed my first Ferro, and it thrilled me, and I began to set out on a quest all through Florence to photograph as many as I possibly could. And now I have more than 60 varieties of sculptural animal heads in Florence, within the city walls. I contained it within the city walls. And this example right here is certainly an early version, but I chose this, the front of this facade. This is the Palazzo Altoviti, and this one was probably created in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. You can see how worn it is and how corroded it is. This particular palazzo must have had two that were missing from years ago, and what they did is they had a current day, early 20th century ironworker recreate two of these for the other side of the facade in order to fill out the front and replace the ones that were missing.
And what was the use of these Ferri? What were they used for?
Well, they're called Ferri per cavalli, and they were used to tether horses from the late 13th century until the early, and they were created until the early 20th century. But when horses went out of use, they turned into decoration only. What happened is that the early ones, once it approached the period of the Renaissance, the Gothic style of architecture went out of fashion, and many Ferri were removed from the facades of palazzi. And then towards the 17th, 18th, 19th century, when expatriates from the United States, Britain, and Germany came to Florence to purchase palazzi, they wanted to restore Florence to its original beauty.
Okay, John, so can you show us some other examples of these?
Yes, I'd be happy to. We're on Borgo Saints Apostoli, and we're just going to take a little stroll down the street, and I'll show you the other examples.
That's great, let's go.
You can clearly notice that this Ferro is very different from the previous one, although there are four of them on the facade, and this is one of the newer ones from the early 20th century, whereas the other ones are from an earlier age, possibly hundreds of years ago. This is another Ferro on Borgo Saints Apostoli, and these Ferri were created through the imagination of early ironworkers at the spur of the moment, really. And they're a very creative yet crude form of early Italian folk art. And this one in particular is called an arpione, which comes from the word harpoon, and it enabled you to actually tether two horses to it. Ferri are very difficult to surmise the age because without carbon dating, it's not possible. So rust forms very quickly, and so do cobwebs and corrosion, and therefore it's impossible to ascertain the exact age of any of the Ferri. Some seem to be earlier, and some seem to be early 20th century.
We suspect the oldest is at the Bargello, is that correct?
In the cortile of the Bargello, there are 32 that are some of the earliest Ferri, and possibly from the late 13th century. This particular Ferro is clearly an early late 1800s to early 20th century example, and to me it's very Picasso-like. And the interesting story about this is that the shop owner, when I first met him, he said that he's had this shop since 1996, and he realized he had a Ferro in the front, but he never looked at the face. And that is a perfect example of how these are seen by thousands of people every day, yet unnoticed. And it's the magic of the Ferri.
So John, this is the last Ferro that we're looking at today. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Yes, this one is clearly much more recent. Ferro and probably created in the early 20th century. As you can see, the Arpione is much more modern than the others on the street.
It's been really interesting today, and we've just looked at a few examples down just one street in Florence.
Yes, yes, and I have to say that this is one of the most rewarding projects I've ever done, and I just hope that my work causes people to notice the Ferri more and appreciate them and celebrate them.
That's great, thank you. And if anyone would like more information about John's work or the Ferri in general in Florence, then please see John's website.